All right, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to wrap up with the very last packet, comprehensive review, 1870 to the present. So make sure you've got those and are ready to go with that. So the kind of thing that we're going to be seeing here with this packet, this is kind of the periods 3 and 4, is the shift and change in balance of power in Europe and kind of how Europe is starting to modernize and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So we start at the top. You can see 1870 to 1918. So this period reasons is sometimes known as the Age of Optimism. So essentially what that means is that the people of Europe are starting, or the people of Europe, especially the leaders of Europe, start to feel kind of like, oh, you know, we can do anything, and we're like the best in the world, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So first of all, I like kind of how it words this on your worksheet. It's got the material base and the non-material base. And so this kind of says, like, what are the reasons why for the Age of Optimism? Why do they think that? So materially, what they've got is wealth, right? So these are the things they actually have. And so one of those things is wealth. Europe is the wealthiest part of the world at this point. They've got world domination, right? Like Pinky and the Brain going on. But essentially what that means here is that they are developing colonies and they are controlling a good portion of the world, right? You know, we've got North America and Canada, South American influence. We've got Africa and Asia and all of these places that they have all over the world. But we also see these kind of reform and democratic movements that are going on in Europe at the time. There is significant industrial growth. And of course, there is science and technology that is being developed with the age of industrialization and kind of everything that's going on with that. And then for non-material base, we've got the ideals of democracy. These are kind of like thoughts, right? So ideologies of democracy, we've got art and literature that represents kind of this optimistic period. And then of course there is the national consciousness. So like the increasing nationalism, the increasing like idea of what it means to be British or French or German, right? Especially in places like Germany and Italy. So these are kind of the ideologies that are beginning through this period. And so all of these things are kind of coming together to really allow people to think like, okay, this is what it means to be European, and this is what makes us the best. And it kind of gives an outward good look for the future that a lot of people have. It also is the age of omens, right? So I kind of like that dichotomy that the worksheet does. So age of optimism, everybody's feeling good, but at the same time, it's this age of omens. And what it means by that is that there are things that are developing that are kind of letting us know that maybe that optimism is ill-placed, right? And so first of all, we have the alliances. Well, if you're starting to ally with somebody, you're kind of preparing for war, right? So it's this idea that alliances are preparation for confrontation, that there's going to be an inevitable conflict, right? You don't ally with somebody necessarily militaristically unless you're kind of expecting something to happen. And then, of course, there is imperialism. So this competition over colonies is huge, right? This idea that we're all going to be fighting for it. You're taking over places, you're going to use force, right? So there's this idea that force is being used, there's competition, there's the superiority complex, right? That social Darwinist idea that like I'm better than these people. And then there is that nationalistic pride that comes along with imperialism as well. Then there is the militarism, right? So militarism is the literal preparedness for war. Right? You are building up, you are rearming, all of these things. There is a literal arms race, like who's going to have the most powerful nation at any given point. Means that you've got troops ready to go, right? You've got these troops that you are having the holding cell, for lack of a better word. Naval competition. Britain and Germany particularly are competing over who's going to have the biggest navy. And then there are, new developments in weaponry, machine guns and tanks and airplanes and submarines, all of these weapons that are going to be kind of used to advanced warfare, right? Then, of course, we have industrialization. Industrialization is profiting from the arms race, right? Like, you use industrialization to build. Again, it's the competition, this kind of idea that you're worried about being the #2 country in Europe, right? Everybody wants to be #1, right? Being second is only the first loser. There's the need for war is going to detract from the growth of democracy and socialism, right? And then there's the need to ensure that you have markets and resources. The idea that we want to make sure that we have, we can get these resources that maybe we don't have for ourselves. You might remember we were talking a little bit in class yesterday about how World War II was basically a war for resources. And we see that starting very early in Europe, right? It's too early in the morning for this, says the one who's almost new. There are some wars that kind of start to be like dress rehearsals, as it were, for World War I. So of course we have the Crimean War, which of course, as I told you in class, is like basically the first modern conflict. So that's the war over territory, Crimea, which is modern day Ukraine, with the Ottomans, the British, and the French up against the brain fart, Russians. There we go. Then we have the 7 Weeks War, which is the war against Austria and Prussia as Bismarck is coming to power. The Franco-Prussian War, which of course again is Prussia and France, Bismarck versus Napoleon III. The end of this war is going to solidify Germany's empire. So the beginning of Germany's empire is going to come out of this war. The Zulu Wars, which are a series of wars against the British and local African groups known as the Zulus, and this just kind of is British domination of Africa. The Russo-Japanese War, which is Russia versus Japan over area in Asia. It kind of shows that Japan is right on the same level as industrial Europe. It's also going to kind of cause some of the issue that's going to be important at the beginning of World War II, even with the territory like such as Korea or Manchuria. And then of course we have the Balkan Wars, which is just issues in the Balkan region of kind of the local nationalist groups there versus Austrian Empire. So this is the era of new imperialism. So new imperialism, old imperialism kind of refers to the initial stage of taking colonies like in the 1500s. So new imperialism starts in the late 1800s. So the causes, of course, again, economic, we need markets, right? The second industrial revolution is kind of starting, and that's much more of a mechanized sort of industrial revolution. So need for resources and markets in order to kind of help out with that. Politically, there's this idea that we want to see whoever gets the most colonies is the best, right? So it's competition with other powers, who's going to be the best power. You can summarize that like in the need for prestige, right? Who's going to be the most the biggest and the baddest, as it were. Socially, the idea of the white man's burden is very much part of that. So like, it's our duty to spread civilization. That's what that means, right? This idea that it's my job as a white man, it's my burden as a white man to spread civilization to the rest of the world. There's also this kind of idea that there's too much population in Europe and they got to go somewhere, right? So kind of like distributing the population of Europe and other parts of the world. And of course, there is that kind of social Darwin aspect to it as well. So that's a big part. Defensively, there's the idea that we need to set up naval bases and have places that we can refuel. This comes from Alfred T. Mahan's book, where basically he talks about how, hey, we've got to like spread the wealth around the world, and we can't do that without naval bases to refuel. So that's going to be a big part of that. And then, of course, nationalism. The more nations you have, the more prestige you have. You know, of all the great nations, what's that little poem? Of all the great nations, gladly we boast or of all the colonies, gladly we boast. Of all the great nations, Great Britain has the most. Right? So it's this idea that the more colonies you have, the more prestige you have, and the better you are. Like, Britain is the best because they have the most colonies. And then this desire to, you want to stop other people from taking it, right? Like, if Britain has it, then the Dutch can't have it, like the Boer Wars, right? So that's a big idea. So kind of some of the ways that they took some of these places in China, it's not necessarily as much about taking it, but about having that economic control in China, right? In Africa, it's more about outright annexation. This is my colony, I'm taking it, right? In Latin America, it's an economic control. So the idea that they owe us money, they're independent, but they owe us money, so we're going to control them through economics. And then the Ottoman Empire is political manipulation, right? So that's kind of where that comes in. So some terms that you need to know for this period of history. We've got revisionist Marxism. So this is the idea that we're taking the original ideas of Marx, of Karl Marx, and we are adapting them to the political structures that we already have, right? So for example, the idea of forming political parties in Great Britain, like the political parties become super important. Shifting from bullets to ballots, right? The idea that we're going to make changes not from fighting and having a violent overthrow, but we're going to elect people instead who can make the changes. Then I've been using this term social Darwinism a bunch. So it's using the ideas of Darwin's evolution and survival of the fittest to justify, well, Europe is the fittest because they're the ones who are taking over, so they have the right to do that. So it's kind of using Darwin's ideas to justify Europe's domination of the rest of the world. Industrial Revolution is the consolidation of companies and corporations, right? So it's less about individual business and more about like these big businesses, the domination of finance capitalism and that sort of idea. And then a very much of an urban society, like the decrease in rural society and an increase in urban society. So it's all about, you know, capital and finance and that sort of idea. So some ideas full of psychology start to develop during this time. So we talk a little bit about Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis. He is the, you know, the sex kind of crazed guy, right? He emphasized, you know, sexual instincts and desires, that basically humans are fighting their desires with their natural instincts. A lot of the things that Freud is doing is he's applying science to the human mind, which is a really big deal. In this time that's never really been done before. And it kind of takes away the personal guilt that people have because like it's natural, it's not my fault that I'm doing this, right? Then there's Carl Jung. He is one of Freud's disciples. He's a co-worker of Freud's. He believed in religious as well as sexual instincts had a dominating impact. So it's not just, you know, your sexual desires, but it's also your religious instincts that influence you. So that's just going to kind of go on to have this impact of the human mind. And then, of course, we've got Albert Einstein, whose theory of relativity kind of throws all of science into kind of this big confusion, changes the way we look at science, and, you know, kind of changes the way that we think about the universe. So this is all kind of what's going on in the background, leading to things like German unification and Italian unification and all of that. But eventually what this is going to really lead to is World War I, right? So the causes of World War I, we've got the main causes, as it were: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. You can also kind of throw industrialization in there, particularly when we're looking at like the rearmament movements, right? That's very much of an industrialization. There is the militaristic forces are outmaneuvering the traditional reasonable diplomacy, right? So instead we're just marching our armies in, right? That kind of idea. So the war itself was a very devastating conflict, as we know. It's really the first modern war. It really kind of shows the world that we're not ready to apply industrialization to kind of this new sort of conflict. So the results that we have politically, because of the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France, their empires are growing. Germany loses territory, right? Russia loses territory. The Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire are broken up, so it's the end of the age of empires. And the United States kind of is like, hey, we're going to isolate ourselves now, right? Like, peace out. We don't need you anymore, right? Economically, we're covered from this, right? It's really not going to be until World War II that really the recovery efforts start to take place, especially in places like Britain and France. A lot of nations are in bankruptcy. Germany is, you know, got that war debt, and they are in economic chaos with hyperinflation. Russia is transforming into a communist society by this point. The United States is really going to be the monetary center of the world during the 20s especially. And of course, during the Great Depression, that's going to change. But definitely during the 20s, the United States is the only one that's really benefiting. Socially, in Britain and France, there is class tension, right? In France, the Republic finally comes into place. In Germany, it is the end of the German monarchy, right? We have the Weimar Republic coming into power. However, you know, nobody really likes the Weimar Republic because of the whole, like, signing the Treaty of Versailles thing, right? For Russia, we obviously have the end of the monarchy there as well. They're kind of trying to establish communism, and we've got Lenin trying to figure out kind of what that's going to look like. And then, of course, there's the League of Nations that is established. The United States does not end up joining the League of Nations because they're so disillusioned with war. They've kind of had this conservative outcry that keeps that from happening. But for the most part, what we're really seeing is kind of some political changes and shifts throughout Europe. And we talked a little bit about those in class as well, where basically everybody is just trying to figure out, all right, what am I going to do now, right? So we can't leave out the Russian Revolution. So from 1918 to 1945, Russia is seeing a huge shift in their structure. So the Tsar Nicholas was incompetent. People saw him as kind of indifferent to the people. He was very conservative. You know, he's the last absolute monarch of Europe, and he's not really making any changes. Tsar seems out of touch, right? And so people are not happy with the things that the Tsar is doing. He's incompetent, he's harsh, it's out of touch with the times. You know, they're so backwards compared to the rest of Europe. So we're really going to see a shift in that. In 1905, the very first revolution takes place. This is a popular uprising against the government. Bloody Sunday, which is where the citizens of Russia were marching on the Winter Palace in order to protest the lack of bread, right? The army opened fires. It kind of reveals that, you know, the regime doesn't really care about the people. It didn't really succeed in 1905 because there are a lot of people still loyal to the Tsar, and the Tsar actually promised some constitutional reforms to the Duma, which is their parliament after this. And so in 1905, it kind of is the first seed of change, right? But the Tsar is still in power then. And so some of those reforms, known as the Stauffenberg reforms, that's what we're going to go with, sure. It's an attempt to place private property in peasant hands, right? So basically kind of redistributing the wealth a little bit. It's kind of a liberal attempt of the Tsar to bolster the regimes. He also tries to kind of establish, he hates the Duma, right? But he does say, like, oh, we're going to use the Duma. It's a liberal attempt. The Tsar, you know, he doesn't really like that he has to do it. He doesn't want to do it, but he's trying to do it, but it's not enough. At this point, it's way too obvious that he's inadequate and he's not really going to make the changes. So the February-March revolutions of 1817, there's chaos in the capital of Russia. The Romanov rule has ended. Lenin has overtaken. Lenin is snuck back into Russia from Germany. The Germans, well, he's in Siberia, but the Germans sneak him back in, hoping he will overthrow the Tsarist regime. It works, right? The Tsars are put under house arrest, and then they are eventually murdered by the people of Russia. So this is the end of the Romanov rule, which had been in power for hundreds of years in Russia. So this is kind of a big step of establishing Bolshevik power. So again, we have Lenin's return to exile. The Russian Civil War starts to take place with the Reds versus the Whites. So there is this kind of idea that Lenin is not going to immediately take power, right? We have the October and November revolutions where Lenin does kind of come into place. He establishes his power. He establishes war communism, which is a very harsh rule with the secret police, with the Cheka, the secret police, C-H-E-K-A. He limits, you know, a lot of the power that's going on, or a lot of the rights of the people during that Civil War period. But of course, the people are not happy with this. So at the end of the Civil War, he establishes the new economic policy, which kind of uses some capitalist policies to get the economics back to place in Russia. There's also a major attack on the Orthodox Church. He reestablishes Russia as the Soviet Union, and that works really great for Lenin until he is killed in 1924. So let's have some of this early Soviet Union. So again, the new economic policy is the failure of war, communism with capitalism, right? That's really what the new economic policy is. It revives the economy of Russia, and by 1926, they're at a pre-war level, right? So they're back to where they were before World War I, by using capitalism and communism, right? The Soviet attitude towards the church, basically there's this big confrontation between the traditional Christianity and atheism, which is what Marx really believes. Marxists don't like religion, and so they also kind of see it like the church and the Romanovs were very closely linked. So they're kind of starting to get rid of the Orthodox Church. As I said, though, Lenin dies in 1924. There's a power struggle. Joseph Stalin takes power, and he's really kind of getting rid of totalitarianism. So he gets rid of Leon Trotsky, who had kind of been Lenin's number 2 right-hand man. He establishes the 5-year plans, which is a major industrialization push. He nationalizes architecture under the collectivization of agriculture, and he starts purging the people, or purging of the country of anybody who talks against capitalism. People just start disappearing. So Joseph Stalin really kind of consolidates that power in Russia. So it is at this point where we do have the rise of totalitarian rule in Europe at this time. So totalitarian is not like absolutism, right? It is the complete domination of all aspects of society by the state, not just political, but social as well. It's often used as an emergency nature, and if the problems can be solved, people are kind of willing to, you know, give over to it, right? And that's really what happens. Keep in mind, this is a right-wing totalitarian rule for the most part. Stalin is like the one exception, but we've got Hitler in Germany, we've got fascism in Italy and Spain, Mussolini and Franco, right? Very nationalistic. That's what fascism is really all about. On the left, we've got Stalin's Soviet Union, you know, stressing that classist society. But for the most part, this is going to be a totalitarianism on the right? Very nationalistic, that sort of idea. We are seeing the collapse of democracies in Europe from 1919 to 1939, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. Basically, the tradition is gone, and they don't really know how to handle the economic strain of the Great Depression. So they're going to collapse. So major steps in the collapse of German democracy and the rise of nationalism. Again, the Weimar Republic, super unpopular because of the war guilt clause, the economic crisis with reparations, super high inflation, revival of nationalism, right? And the need for protection. They don't have a military, so they're like, we got to protect ourselves. So that's really going to be what allows Hitler and the Nazis to come into power. So I actually just want to look here. This compares the Congress of Vienna, this next section, the Treaty of Versailles and Yalta, which is the conference at the end of World War II. So Vienna negotiated a peace treaty where Versailles and Yalta dictated peace terms. So Vienna is a negotiation, Versailles and Yalta are dictations, right? It's going to be, this is exactly what's going to happen. According to Versailles and Yalta, the losers are criminals. Vienna are like, no, we're going to reestablish the losers into European society, right? So we're going to let France come back as long as they follow the traditions. And so that's kind of an interesting twist that we see here. So just some terms that you need to know about Europe in this period during the rise of totalitarianism in World War II. So the League of Nations is that plan for, is that security plan, like all the nations try to resolving international problems. Super ineffectual, right? Does not work. The conference at Rapallo, nations gathered to discuss armaments and made agreements about the Italian and Yugoslav border. It's just kind of one of those peace agreements during the 20s and 30s, such as the Locarno Pact. So the Locarno Pact is kind of Germany getting back on the good side of Britain and France, but the German people are not crazy about it, right? The Dawes Plan is the United States kind of stepping in, loaning money to Germany, helping them out. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is what outlaws war. It's kind of this optimistic, like war is going to be illegal, right? Like who's going to follow that? So the Popular Fronts, what this basically is looking at is groups of people who are trying to kind of solve keep fascism out of their nations. So it's a coalition, a group of people from the left and from the center against the radical right, against fascist. It works in France, it does not in Spain, right? So this is the two places it's going to be, the Popular Fronts. Works in France, not in Spain. The Third Reich is Hitler's Germany. That's what he calls it, the Third Regime. 1933 to 1945 is when it is in power. We've got Franco, I've mentioned him a couple times. He is the right-wing fascist in Spain, victor of the Spanish Civil War, right? Spanish Civil War. You may remember from what we talked about in class is, you know, a bunch of people in Europe kind of joined up to try and keep the fascists out. But Hitler and Mussolini joined together with Franco, and he is the victor of that. Anschluss, that means connection, right? This is the unification of Germany and Austria at the beginning of World War II. Just kind of showing that there are some places who are welcoming Hitler's regime, and that is one of those places. The Unit Conference was a meeting between Britain and Germany about the Sudetenland and the Czechoslovakian border. It is an appeasement, right? Like peace in our time is what Neville Chamberlain said. Peace in our time is crap. It does not work, right? And it is just a few years later that World War II begins. The Anti-Common-Internment Pact, or as I like to call it, the Pact of Steel, right? This is a German, Italian, and Japanese alliance. It is anti-communist. It's interesting. It is the beginning of the Axis powers. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Non-Aggression Pact, is a pact between the Soviet Union and Germany that we're not going to attack each other. It's really Germany's way of avoiding a Eastern Front during the war. He has full intention of turning his back on it, and he does. The Atlantic Charter is basically an agreement between Churchill and Roosevelt. It's kind of, they say, all right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of use diplomacy, not a peace treaty, right? So they meet and they kind of come up with the basis for what's going to happen in Europe post-World War II. Pearl Harbor is the attack of Japanese on the United States, kind of gets the U.S. entry into World War II. Stalingrad is the Stalin victory over the Nazis. It kind of is the first major defeat. It shows that Hitler's not invincible. And this is going to be the turning point that turns the war in favor of the Allies. D-Day, the amphibious liberation of France. So the Allies are able to get into France, liberate Paris, and push into Germany. Yalta is the conference that shows the design for the conclusion of the war. It kind of is what's going to happen after the European phase is over. It sets up the separation of Germany. San Francisco Conference forms the United Nations. So that's, you know, the sun, so to speak, of the League of Nations, and it's going to be a much more effective. Potsdam Conference is the final solution for the European borders and the promise of post-war elections. So kind of what are we going to do in Europe after the end of the war? How are we going to establish democracy and free elections? Stalin turns his back on this, right? So that's a big deal. And then at the end of the war, we have the Nuremberg trials, which is what puts German leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. It's the first time this ever happens, you know, that really uncovers a lot of the what had been going on during the Holocaust and that sort of thing, and really just kind of opens up this idea that now we are protecting humanity as well, right? So it's the trials of German political officials for their crimes against humanity. So, new stuff for everybody. What goes on in post-war Europe, right? Wrapping this up here. So we've got post-World War II in Europe. So this is the beginning of the Cold War. So we've got the Allied powers who are basically teaming up against the Soviets, right? So the peace between the Soviets and Britain and France and the United States lasted all of 5 seconds, right? So we are now basically seeing like all of those countries who had been enemies during World War II are teaming up against the Soviets, right? That's really what this is all about, because now communism is seen as the major threat. The Truman Doctrine is the containment policy set up by the United States, by Harry Truman. It basically says that we are going to oppose the spread of communism, particularly in Greece and Turkey at the time. It's the end of U.S. isolation, right? U.S. is getting involved. This is a really big deal that we're seeing in this period. The Marshall Plan is U.S. economic aid that also combats the spread of communism in Western Europe. Okay. The Communiform is the Soviet Union promotion of communism. So it's kind of their fight back against the Truman Doctrine. So Soviet Union is kind of trying to fight back some of those, the containment policy and kind of what's going on there. We have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a defensive alliance between the Western European powers against the Soviet Union and communism. The Soviets respond with the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe allying against NATO. And then, of course, we have the problem of divided Germany. So Germany was divided into 4 sectors at the end of World War II, with Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviets, all of the Allied powers, taking control of each one. They also did the same thing in Berlin. The problem is the communists cut off East Germany, right? And they cut off Berlin. The United States are basically what we're going to be seeing is that Iron Curtain falling, right? Where on one side of Germany and Eastern Europe, we've got communism. On the other side, we've got democracy and capitalism. And so it basically splits Germany into an economic unit, the agricultural East and the industrial West, right? That's kind of the big problem here. All right, so the non-Western world, kind of what's going on with the rest of the world and it's going to affect. So China falls to the communists in 1949 with Mao Zedong as the leader. In Korea, we've got communist North Korea and democratic South Korea. North Korea invades the South. This is going to be kind of the first major military action about communism. The war ends with nothing changing. Communist North, capitalist democratic South. Japan actually enforces a Western-style democracy. So they are kind of pushing back against the Russians there in Japan. So they stay democratic. They don't fall to communism and end up becoming allies of the democratic countries. So you can see that all the World War II alliances and tension really kind of shifts. In India wins its independence and it partitions. So India splits between India and Pakistan with mostly Hindus in India and Muslims in Pakistan. And it is going to be a growth of a social and military dictatorship. But they do achieve self-determination from the British Empire. In the Middle East, there is tension with the new creation of Israel and kind of the conflict with the Arab-Israeli conflict, Arab-Israeli tension, and basically we're just going to see continuing tension in the Middle East. In Vietnam, it is the end of French colonization and the beginning of U.S. intervention, right? So as communists are kind of coming to power in Vietnam, we're going to see intervention of the United States and the Allies. In Africa, we see massive decolonization movements, and it leads to a lot of problems and dictatorships all throughout Africa. So the terms that you need to know, of course, the Holocaust is Germany's final solution, trying to rid Europe of Jews, right? The common market is the creation of a common economic unit in Germany. Or in Europe, rather. This is going to be, or this is going to lead in the 90s to the creation of the EU, okay? The Vatican Council II, this is the Roman Catholic kind of dialogue with the world, right? It basically says that the church is going to end the Reformation. Yes, we're talking the 1500s, Counter-Reformation, right? And basically it's the church saying, you know what? We accept the changing world politics and we're going to work with you now, right? So it's basically the Catholic Church kind of ending their separation with the rest of the world. We have Pope John the 23rd. Woo, it's a lot of Johns. He kind of proposed, he was the head of the Vatican Council. He kind of proposed the spirit of openness, peace on earth, right? So the Catholic Church is kind of trying to ease some of those tensions. We also see the increased rise of existentialism, that philosophy that human life is kind of worthless and absurd and life is pointless, right? We have the SALT treaties. So the SALT treaties are an attempt in the later Cold War that kind of to limit strategic arms. It's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So it's kind of the attempt to limit nuclear weapons between the United States and Soviet Union. Détente is the term that refers to the gradual relaxation of Cold War tensions. It starts under Nixon in the 70s. Glasnost is means openness. This is when Khrushchev is in power in Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, and it is Gorbachev, sorry, not Khrushchev, Gorbachev. So Gorbachev is G-O-R-B-A-C-H-E-V, right? So Gorbachev starts to work with the Western world. He kind of allows, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Perestroika is Gorbachev's attempt to establish new economic policies in the Soviet Union. It's a loosening of the communist policies and the introduction of free market into it. And then in the 1990s, the communist world really starts to fall apart. Germany is unified, the Soviet Union collapses, and all of the satellite countries of the Soviet Union, communism falls. And we're really just seeing the end of the Cold War and all of these countries kind of starting to reestablish democracies and the problems that that causes, as well as the establishment of the European Union and kind of the collectivization of all of Europe into one major power. So that was a quick overview. Please make sure that you do study this stuff. I know that sometimes this modern stuff does end up on the exam, so it is important to know that, especially for first semester people. We didn't get to this in class, so you got to pay attention to this kind of stuff. So I hope this was a good kind of overview for you. Please check out a lot of the other review worksheets that I have on my website. It is very important to check those out. The exam's in 2 weeks, guys. We got to study. Like, if you're not studying now, you're too late, right? Now, I mean, not too late to pass. Give me that. But you should have started studying weeks ago, really. So, yeah, here we go. AP Euro, guys. We're almost there. We're almost done. All right. I will see you guys next week in class. Otherwise, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message, and I'll solve those out for you. And I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.